Love rarely dies loudly. It almost never ends at the moment people imagine. An argument, a mistake, a dramatic revelation. Instead, it fades in the quiet spaces between words, in the pauses that grow heavier, in the moments when admiration begins to erode grain by grain. What once felt like warmth slowly cools into something unrecognizable. Two people who were once inseparable suddenly feel like strangers sitting across a small table with an ocean between them. And there is no single event to blame, only a silent, unseen shift. It begins subtly, a dismissive comment brushed aside as a joke, a moment of belittlement disguised as advice, a feeling of being unheard, or worse, unseen. These tiny fractures accumulate until the foundation that held the relationship together becomes uneven. People try to ignore it, hoping affection alone will be strong enough to compensate. But affection on its own is fragile. Without respect, it becomes a burden. And the person who carries that burden feels themselves shrinking to keep the peace. Carl Jung believed that the roots of resentment lie not in conflict, but in humiliation. When someone feels their value is decreasing in the eyes of the person they love, they experience a psychological injury far deeper than disappointment. They feel diminished in their own eyes, and a love that diminishes you is indistinguishable from a slow form of betrayal. This is the paradox that haunts so many relationships. The more someone gives without receiving respect in return, the more they begin to resent the very person they once adored. Love without equality slowly mutates into dependence. Dependence turns into frustration, and frustration, left unacknowledged, hardens into bitterness. Many people wonder how someone who once made their heart race can later trigger silence, avoidance, or even anger. How the sight of someone once cherished can now tighten the chest instead of soothing it. The answer is rarely as complicated as people think. When love is stripped of admiration, affection becomes suffocating. When dignity is lost, attachment becomes a prison. And Jung understood that any emotion that imprisons the soul eventually transforms into its dark counterpart. This is the quiet tragedy we will explore. How respect acts as the invisible architecture of love. How its absence rewires the heart. And how affection without dignity does not simply fade, it decays. The story begins here, in the fragile moment when love starts dying, not with a shout, but with a whisper. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within themselves a second self, an invisible companion made up of everything they deny, suppress, or fear about themselves. He called it the shadow. Most people imagine the shadow as something dark or malicious, but Jung's idea was far more nuanced. The shadow is not simply the bad part of you. It is the part of you that remains unacknowledged. Anger you never expressed, desires you never admitted, fears you never confronted, and potential you never allowed to grow. And although it stays hidden beneath consciousness, it does not stay silent. It shapes your reactions, your impulses, your choices, and more powerfully than anywhere else, it shapes your relationships. Jung believed that the moment two people enter a relationship, their shadows enter with them, not as guests, but as active forces. In the beginning, love creates an illusion of perfect harmony. You project the best version of yourself onto the other person, and they project theirs onto you. It feels like destiny, chemistry, something larger than life. But projection is fragile. It shatters the moment reality contradicts fantasy. And when the projection collapses, the shadow steps in to fill the space. This is why relationships often transform from affection to resentment with frightening speed. What people call falling out of love or seeing someone's true colors is usually the moment when each partner's shadow begins to speak. The unhealed, unacknowledged parts of both individuals rise to the surface. The things they refuse to deal with internally suddenly become external conflicts. Jung wrote that a relationship without self-awareness becomes a theater of unconscious forces. If one person enters with deep insecurity, they may idealize their partner to avoid facing it. If the other enters with a need for control, they may dominate to hide their own fear of inadequacy. The relationship becomes a dance between the giver and the taker, the pleaser and the avoider, the dominant and the submissive. Not because either person consciously chooses those roles, but because their shadows choose them. And this imbalance slowly corrodes respect, the foundation that holds love upright. When one partner sacrifices too much, resents quietly, apologizes excessively, or suppresses their own needs, they become a magnet for unconscious exploitation. The other partner begins taking without realizing they are taking. This is how affection decays, not through sudden betrayal, but through a gradual erosion of boundaries. Jung emphasized that the most destructive relationships are not between good and bad people, but between unconscious people. When neither partner recognizes their own shadow, they start projecting it onto each other. A small mistake becomes a threat. A disagreement becomes an attack. A moment of vulnerability becomes a sign of weakness. They begin fighting ghosts, fragments of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, while believing they are fighting each other. History offers countless examples. Monarchs who married for power but feared vulnerability turned their spouses into political enemies. Public figures who sought admiration from their partners became tyrants when faced with criticism. Even in ancient myths, lovers who failed to confront their inner darkness destroyed each other through jealousy, suspicion, or pride. The pattern repeats because the psychology remains the same. When respect dies, the shadow takes command. Modern psychology echoes Jung's warnings. Therapists observe that when boundaries collapse, resentment fills the gap. People begin to blame their partners for feelings that actually originate within themselves. The relationship becomes a mirror, one they can no longer bear to look into. Jung's central message is simple but provocative. The health of any relationship depends not on love alone, but on how consciously each person deals with their own shadow. Without that self-awareness, intimacy becomes a battleground where unresolved inner conflicts fight for dominance. With it, the relationship becomes a transformative space, where two individuals grow not by defeating each other, but by understanding themselves. Disrespect does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters a relationship quietly, disguised as concern, guidance, or affection. Yet beneath its surface lies the simplest and most destructive truth. One person stops seeing the other as an equal. Respect is not about politeness, tone, or surface-level decency. It is the deep recognition that the person in front of you has their own mind, their own choices, their own inner world. When that recognition fades, everything built on top of it begins to collapse.
Psychologists describe respect as the psychological boundary that protects individuality. It is what allows two people to love each other without dissolving into each other. But the moment one person assumes moral, emotional, or intellectual superiority, a hierarchy forms. and love, by its nature, cannot survive hierarchy. A relationship built on unequal power becomes a slow-moving implosion. One partner quietly shrinks while the other expands without noticing. Emotional dominance is often the first crack in the foundation. It does not always involve aggression. Sometimes it is wrapped in certainty. One person becomes the teacher, and the other becomes the student. One becomes the judge, the other the defendant. Over time, the dominant partner begins to believe their perspective is inherently clearer, wiser, or more rational. This subtle shift creates a psychological imbalance. The submissive partner, sensing the imbalance, begins to silence their needs, minimize their feelings, and prioritize harmony at the cost of authenticity. Small belittlings then follow, statements delivered with a smile, jokes that cut deeper than they appear, comments implying that one person would be lost without the other's guidance. What starts as gentle correction gradually becomes a pattern of minimization. These micro-incisions chip away at dignity, and dignity is the oxygen of love. When someone feels diminished, admiration dies, and without admiration, affection loses its structure. Even more dangerous is the moral hierarchy that sometimes forms inside relationships. One partner may begin to believe they're more ethical, more mature, or more self-aware. Their choices become the right choices. Their opinions become the objective truth. They no longer argue, they instruct. They no longer disagree, they diagnose. And in doing so, they turn the relationship into a courtroom where one is always defending their humanity. This dynamic feeds directly into the giver-taker imbalance. The giver, driven by fear of loss or fear of conflict, tries to compensate through over-effort, more patience, more empathy, more sacrifice. The taker, operating unconsciously, grows accustomed to being prioritized. They begin to interpret the giver's sacrifices not as generosity, but as obligation. Entitlement sprouts, gratitude fades, and dependency becomes the fuel for deep, simmering resentment. Jungian psychology offers a powerful explanation. The human psyche, even when passive on the surface, rebels against domination. Somewhere inside, the dominated partner feels a growing urge to reclaim autonomy. This rebellion might appear as emotional withdrawal, loss of attraction, or subtle hostility. It might emerge as sudden bursts of anger, or as a quiet internal vow, I won't let myself be controlled. On the other side, the dominant partner senses the withdrawal and tries to tighten their influence, creating an escalating cycle of tension. Social psychologists have long observed that love thrives on mutual admiration. When two people see each other as equals, equally complex, equally flawed, equally capable, they meet in the middle with authenticity. But when admiration flows only one way, the relationship begins to rot from the inside. In a hierarchy, the person at the top cannot admire the one below them, and the person below cannot fully trust the one above them. Intimacy requires vulnerability, but vulnerability cannot exist where one person feels inferior. Power imbalance destroys love, not through sudden destruction, but through a gradual erosion of humanity. The relationship becomes less a partnership and more an arrangement. The giver becomes exhausted, the taker becomes disappointed, and both slowly lose respect, not just for each other, but for themselves. In the end, disrespect is not the absence of kindness, it is the absence of equality. And once equality dies, love becomes powerless to save what remains. Hatred is not the opposite of love. Indifference is. Hatred is something far more tragic. Love that has decayed, soured, and collapsed under the weight of unmet dignity. Carl Jung believed that when love transforms into hatred, it is rarely because affection vanished. Instead, it is because something essential to love, respect, equality, mutual recognition, was missing from the beginning or eroded over time. When the foundation is absent, the emotion begins to rot from within. Love without respect creates a psychological paradox. A person may feel affection, longing, and attachment, yet at the same time feel unseen, unheard, or diminished. They are emotionally invested, yet emotionally invalidated. This creates a quiet internal conflict. How can I love someone who does not honor who I am? And because this conflict has no clear resolution, it burrows deeper into the psyche, forming bitterness that grows slowly and silently. Jung wrote that the human soul cannot tolerate being ignored, dismissed, or controlled without consequence. When someone loves deeply but is not respected, they start to feel invisible, like a presence that is tolerated rather than valued. Their emotions become background noise in the relationship. Their identity becomes optional. It is here that the earliest seeds of hatred begin to grow, not loud, explosive hatred, but a subtle ache that feels like emotional dishonor. Emotional dependence makes this process even more corrosive. If one partner relies on the other for validation or stability, any form of disrespect becomes amplified. Dependence without respect turns affection into humiliation. The dependent partner internalizes the imbalance, believing they must endure mistreatment to preserve the relationship. But the psyche remembers every small betrayal of self-worth. Over time, those memories accumulate like sediment, layer after layer of unresolved pain. Meanwhile, the partner with more power often fails to see the transformation taking place. They assume love is steady because the relationship remains intact on the surface. But internally, the emotional weight is being carried by only one person. Unshared emotional labor is like an overfilled vessel. Every new disappointment adds pressure, and every ignored boundary tightens the seal. Eventually, the internal tension becomes unsustainable. This is the moment Jung described as love collapsing under its own emotional gravity. The person who once gave endlessly begins to feel drained, then frustrated, then resentful. Love feels like a burden rather than a connection. They begin to associate the other person not with affection, but with the loss of their own self-respect. The mind rewires the emotional narrative. This person makes me feel small. They make me feel weak. They make me feel unseen. What was once love becomes something darker, an emotional aversion fueled by the memory of being diminished. Hatred does not emerge because the heart stopped feeling. It emerges because the heart was forced to feel too much without receiving recognition in return. Jung believed that this is why hatred feels so intense. It is the energy of love distorted by injustice.
In the end, the transformation is not a mystery. Love without respect is emotional gravity without balance. It pulls one person downward until resentment becomes the only force strong enough to push back. And when that moment arrives, hatred appears, not as the death of love, but as the final cry of a love that was never allowed to stand with dignity. Admiration is the hidden architecture of love. It is the quiet force that binds affection to respect, attachment to dignity, and desire to meaning. Without admiration, love becomes weightless, unanchored, and strangely fragile. It drifts until something breaks. And once it breaks, the emotional collapse is rarely gentle. Imagine two people who once saw each other as extraordinary. They admired each other's strengths, dreams, intelligence, or resilience. This admiration wasn't dramatic. It was woven into the small things, the way one spoke with conviction, the way the other handled stress, the spark of curiosity, the ability to listen, the way they made the world feel bigger rather than smaller. Every relationship that begins with real affection begins with this subtle reverence. It's the spark that tells the psyche, this person is worthy of my heart. But admiration is not immune to erosion. When disrespect enters a relationship, slowly, almost invisibly, it begins to scratch at the surface of that reverence. A dismissive tone, a broken promise, a moment of selfishness at the worst possible time. These small cracks don't seem catastrophic at first, but the psyche feels them, it stores them, and each one weakens the emotional scaffolding the relationship depends on. As the cracks accumulate, something profound begins to shift. The mind starts rewriting its own memories. The moments that once felt magical begin to feel naive in retrospect. What was once interpreted as charming now feels irritating. Behaviors once tolerated as quirks now feel like flaws. The admiration that once elevated the partner now reverses direction, pulling them downward. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment the shadow steps forward. The shadow needs an object. When admiration dies, the partner becomes that object. Their imperfections seem sharper, their actions more intentional, their mistakes unforgivable. The unconscious, desperate to restore balance, projects the unresolved resentment onto the other person. This projection magnifies every small irritation into a symbol of deeper disappointment. A partner breathing too loudly, speaking too slowly, laughing at the wrong moment becomes unbearable. What used to be unnoticed details now become evidence of incompatibility, disrespect, or even betrayal. This is the emotional shattering, not always loud, but always irreversible. Once admiration collapses, disgust often follows. Not the superficial disgust we experience with strangers, but a deeper psychological form, a sense of emotional contamination. The presence of the partner feels heavy, suffocating. Their touch feels obligatory rather than comforting. Their words lose their weight. Their face becomes a reminder of broken expectations. And this contrast is what makes the hatred feel so intense. The emotional energy that once fueled love now has nowhere to go. It mutates. The intensity that once lifted the relationship now crushes it. The person who once felt like a source of warmth becomes a reminder of inner wounds. The more one tries to return to the past, the more impossible it feels, because admiration cannot be forced back into existence. Once shattered, it loses its original shape forever. This is why broken admiration feels like heartbreak mixed with betrayal, even when no explicit betrayal ever occurred. The psyche mourns not just the relationship, but the loss of the idealized reflection it once cherished. And in that mourning, hatred becomes the mind's attempt to sever the bond completely. It is a psychological survival mechanism. Pain transforming into rejection, connection transforming into repulsion, and love transforming into something as powerful but far darker. In the end, hatred isn't the opposite of love. It is the collapse of the mirror through which love once saw its beauty. Modern psychology reveals a truth that aligns uncannily with Jung's warnings. Relationships do not collapse because love fades. They collapse because emotional boundaries erode. Love without boundaries becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without reciprocity becomes self-betrayal. The moment someone betrays themselves for the sake of preserving a connection, the relationship begins to rot from the inside out. Emotional safety is the foundation of secure attachment. This safety is created by not constant affection, but by mutual respect. Two people recognizing each other's autonomy, desires, and psychological space. When disrespect enters, even in subtle forms, that safety shatters. A dismissive comment, a joke that cuts too deep, a repeated failure to listen. Modern psychology shows that these small ruptures activate the brain's threat response, pushing the relationship into an insecure pattern. Those who fear losing the relationship often respond by giving more patience, more understanding, more forgiveness, more emotional labor. They think that loving harder will stabilize what is falling apart. But the irony is painful. The one who gives the most is often the one who ends up the most wounded. By abandoning their boundaries, they begin abandoning themselves, and no amount of devotion can compensate for the absence of self-respect. Attachment theory describes two common reactions to disrespect. The anxiously attached cling tighter, hoping affection will restore harmony. They tolerate behaviors that chip away at their dignity, believing that endurance is proof of love. But endurance only deepens the imbalance. Over time, resentment builds, even if they try to suppress it. The avoidantly attached respond differently. They withdraw. They create emotional distance, not because they don't care, but because they feel overwhelmed or suffocated. When they sense disrespect, their instinct is self-protection, often interpreted as indifference. Both patterns, clinginess or withdrawal, are not signs of incompatibility. They are signs of a broken foundation. Boundaries act as psychological architecture. They preserve admiration by preventing dependency. They maintain dignity by ensuring reciprocity. They protect connection by maintaining individuality. When boundaries dissolve, the relationship becomes lopsided. One partner absorbing emotional burdens, the other unconsciously taking advantage of the imbalance. Even if unintentional, this dynamic breeds quiet resentment. Modern therapists often emphasize that the greatest predictor of long-term relationship health is not how often people say, "I love you," but how consistently they honor each other's boundaries. Respect in this context is emotional oxygen. Without it, the relationship suffocates, no matter how intense the affection once was. Self-respect becomes the final pillar, the force that determines whether love grows or decays. A person who respects themselves will not tolerate being minimized, controlled, or emotionally drained. They will communicate their needs clearly, enforce boundaries, and leave when necessary. Paradoxically, this self-respect makes them more attractive and creates healthier dynamics. Their partner cannot easily fall into dominance, exploitation, or entitlement because the boundaries prohibit it.
In contrast, someone who sacrifices themselves to preserve love ends up losing both love and themselves. Modern psychology confirms what Jung implied long ago. When you give up your autonomy, your shadow begins to rebel. That rebellion eventually manifests as resentment, anger, or emotional withdrawal. And in the end, the truth is simple, yet profound. Love cannot survive where self-respect is absent. Boundaries are not walls, they're the structure that keeps admiration alive. Only when both individuals maintain their emotional integrity does love evolve instead of collapse. The turning point in every unbalanced relationship arrives quietly, almost invisibly. It's the moment a person realizes they're no longer fighting for the relationship, they're fighting against their own disappearance. And from this realization, a truth begins to rise. The only cure for love poisoned by disrespect is the restoration of self-respect. Rebuilding love is not a matter of giving more, pleasing more, or proving one's worth. Those strategies only tighten the chains that created the imbalance in the first place. When someone tries to earn respect through sacrifice, they end up reinforcing the very dynamic that destroys them. Real healing begins not when the other person changes, but when the individual recognizes the cost of abandoning their dignity.
Self-respect becomes the first act of emotional liberation. It is the decision to protect your boundaries, even if it risks losing the relationship. It is choosing clarity over confusion, honesty over silent suffering, and independence over emotional imprisonment. This shift does not guarantee reconciliation, but it guarantees something far more important: psychological wholeness. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, is incompatible with relationships where one's value is constantly minimized. A person cannot grow if they are forced to shrink. They cannot evolve if they are required to suppress their truth to maintain someone else's comfort. Individuation demands space, integrity, and the courage to confront one's shadow, even when that confrontation means walking away from what once felt essential. Self-respect reshapes the emotional landscape of any relationship. When boundaries are reintroduced, the dynamic shifts. The partner who once dominated is confronted with the reality that they no longer have unearned power. The one who once overgave begins to reclaim their emotional life. Sometimes this restoration creates a healthier connection. Sometimes it reveals that the relationship cannot survive without imbalance. Either outcome is a form of freedom. The escape is not dramatic. It is quiet, deliberate, and internal. It's the moment someone says, "I will no longer trade pieces of myself to keep someone else comfortable." That realization is the beginning of psychological rebirth. There is a profound empowerment in understanding this. You cannot force someone to respect you, but you can refuse to remain where you are not respected. You cannot control another's love, but you can stop betraying yourself in the pursuit of it. In the end, the cure is not found in desperation or devotion. It is found in the decision to honor your worth. Because when self-respect returns, clarity returns, strength returns, and the version of you that once felt small finally remembers that love without dignity is just another form of captivity. Love begins long before two people meet, and it continues long after they part. It begins in the silent corners of the self, in the places where dignity, courage, and self-knowledge first take root. And in the end, every story about love is actually a story about the human psyche struggling to understand its own depths. Jung believed that two individuals cannot truly love each other unless they are whole within themselves, because otherwise love becomes a battlefield of projections, wounds, and power imbalances. In that sense, respect is not an accessory to love. It is the foundation without which nothing meaningful can survive. When respect collapses, something subtle but irreversible happens. The other person is no longer seen as a full human being with desires, fears, and an inner world. They become an object, a tool for comfort, validation, distraction, or ego reinforcement. And once someone is objectified, love cannot breathe. Its essence requires the recognition of another's humanity, the acknowledgement that the person standing before you is not yours to mold or control, but a sovereign being with their own destiny. Without that recognition, the relationship begins to decay in ways that feel mysterious, but are brutally predictable. This is why so many people walk away from relationships feeling confused. They believe love died because of mismatched personalities, arguments, or emotional distance. But often, something deeper was happening beneath the surface. One person stopped treating the other as an equal, and the structure holding the relationship together silently crumbled. Love does not always end loudly. Sometimes it transforms quietly into its opposite. Affection becomes resentment. Warmth becomes coldness. Vulnerability becomes ammunition. And what remains is not love's absence, but its shadow, something twisted, bitter, and painful to untangle. But here is the quiet truth that gives this entire journey meaning. Love that rests on respect does not shatter under conflict or hardship.
It does not disappear when flaws are exposed. It survives because it is anchored in something deeper than emotion. It is anchored in reverence for another soul's inner life. When two people guard each other's dignity, they create a space where growth, disagreement, and even suffering can occur without destroying the bond. In the end, love does not begin with passion or connection or even compatibility. It begins with the decision to honor the humanity of another person while never abandoning your own. That is the only kind of love strong enough to endure the storms of the psyche. And without respect, all that remains is a fragile illusion, beautiful at first glance, but destined to collapse under the weight of what